A warm welcome to Cue Technology. This topic stretches over a whole range of protocols and we can never ignore it because it's always playing its part, and it's one of my favourite topics. When I really got my head into understanding more about it and how it works and why the dogs are responding to the world around them, everything just started to open up. So as with all terminology, we need to be really crystal clear on our definitions and agree that we understand the terms we are using. Often these originate in a different field or were historically accurate at the time of definition, but no longer serve the same function because our understanding of what's happening has actually changed. So an example of this would be command. In dog training, we don't regard ourselves as the masters that are giving out orders. The dogs are not soldiers. And in the fields of science, stimulus is the common term. And in dog training, we now hear the cue as the most usable jargon. But funny enough, it doesn't translate well into other languages. They would probably use signal more often. So cue technology, it is a technology. A technology is use and knowledge of tools, techniques, systems, or methods in order to serve a purpose or to solve a problem, which means we have to learn how to use it and work out exactly what it is to the best of our knowledge at this time. So for me, the purpose is communication. It's from me to the dog and from the dog to me. You can see here she is giving me her what face. This is called what you got and what you want. And secondly, I want to look at how or why the dog is responding to the world around them. So if I'm teaching the dog to do something and something else happens, what cue was she actually responding to at that moment? So in the UK, we drink tea, lots and lots and lots of tea. When we want tea, we often stand by the kettle waiting for it to switch off, and that switch is a cue. It's a cue for me to pour the boiling water onto the tea. But if you don't drink tea, this means nothing to you at all. Yes, it's just a background sound. But for me, it is a prediction of a reward. So I'm very sensitive to listening to that, not a particularly loud noise. If you have a kettle that whistles, you will tend to be very attuned to that, and I promptly respond to it because the tea needs freshly boiled water, not water that boiled several minutes ago. So a microwave may ping, and I might come from another room, but I won't respond to it that quickly unless I'm actually urgently needing what's in the microwave. So how sensitive you are to that cue will depend on how much you value that reward and how much you want it at that moment. So if I've just finished 3 cups of tea, I'm not going to respond to that cue at all. I'm not as keen on it. So a cue is a reward predicting stimulus. If there is no reward, or I have no experience of that reward, or I'm unable to predict that reward is coming, I cannot respond to the stimulus. I can't respond to the cue. So we use the term cue as shorthand, but understanding it as a function of a reward, a prediction, and a stimulus gives us insight into understanding the technology behind it. Anytime we're not seeing the expected response, just in your mind replace the word cue for reward, predicting, stimulus, and you'll nearly always find the answer. So a stimulus or a stimuli is something that will stimulate the senses. So it will stimulate touch, sight, sound, taste, or smell, or a combination of those senses. So we could see and hear something, and in some situations one sense can block out another sense. So if we are straining to see something in the distance, or the dog is scenting something of great potential importance, that can block hearing. So we might not see something directly in front of us if we're trying to listen to something that's hard to hear. So if the dog is not in a position to sense the stimuli, they cannot hear it. or they cannot see it, then the cue cannot function as a cue. So prediction requires experience and memory. How well we remember will often depend on the value and the impact that reward had at that moment. So we have to include the dog's ability to connect it to a moment or an activity that was actually happening. And never forget that a reward is something that is valued as a reward by the dog. And we only know that they value this because we see evidence of approach and desire. If you're pushing rewards at a dog, you cannot be sure that at that moment in time they desire that. We need to see the approach, and I appreciate that after 3 cups of tea I've had enough, so satiation has occurred and I no longer value tea as a reward. So rewards, that can be an object that has been learned. So a toy itself is not a reward until the dog has learned to play with it and find that play enjoyable. A leash is just a piece of rope. A dog bowl is just a piece of china or some metal. People, or strangers, could have no reward, and you could distinguish that only familiar people have a reward. It could be an event that is an attraction and we enjoy it. So learning is an event where we gain more rewards. Eating, walking, hunting, sniffing, being groomed, greeting familiar people. An activity that gives us pleasure. Playing will be a reward. Chasing something could be a reward. Chewing something, running, searching. Or a situation that we enjoy. Companionship. For Merrick, the Gordon setter, situation is always going to have sunshine as part of it, and comfort. It could be social approval, it could be inclusion in being part of a group, and certainly security will be a reward for the dog. So if our cue is functioning properly as a reward predicting stimulus, then we shall see cue seeking. So we begin our communication with the reward. What is the predictable reward? And does this drive cue seeking? If it does, then we can proceed and start to deliver cues. But we need to be sure that the dog has learned that cue seeking itself is rewarded. Cue seeking will be driven by the reward value, what the dog perceives as the reward value. Not what we wish it to be, but what the dog perceives as the reward value. So my first action when I start any training session, will the dog be cue seeking? Without cue seeking, either the environment is too competing or the dog has not learned that the reward comes as a result of cue seeking, seeking information from me as to what earns that reward. So you could see she got a good scent. Oh my goodness, that's chicken. I love chicken. Where's my person? The stronger that reward value, the greater the cue seeking. And that will be so important later on when you're training in a complex environment that's surrounded by hundreds of opportunities for reward. A powerful reward should drive your cue seeking. So when I'm learning something new, I like to draw pictures and I visualize the underlying principles. So these are my symbols that I'll tend to use. So the flowery thing is the reward predicting stimulus, which is going to be the scent, the sound, the touch, the smell. And the little bottle of pink pleasure is going to be our reward. So when we pair our stimulus with our reward, that stimulus will build up an expectation of reward. There will become a prediction of that reward happening. This is classical conditioning. And for operant conditioning, that reward is going to be delivered as a consequence of the action that happened in response to the stimulus. The neat thing about this is that when we're doing operant conditioning, we're also building in a classical effect. So when the dog hears that stimulus for spin or touch or blue, which is my paw cue, she will have a memory of that being pleasurable. And that memory works as an incentive to do the action. So the cue doesn't only say, do that behaviour, it incentivizes the dog to actually do the behaviour, and if they do get it right, and it's exactly what I was looking for, the reward follows. So the moment the dog registers that cue, the anticipation is starting to build. A reward is probable. They come up with the response, and our marker guarantees the reward. So the marker turns out to be a reward predicting stimulus as well. It would almost be impossible not to have some marker of some sort, because the minute you make a gesture to deliver the reward, which could be turning your head towards the treat pot, or I take a step towards it, or you put your hand in your pocket, that is serving as the marker because it guarantees the reward. So the only difference between a cue and a marker, which is selected by the dog, not what we want it to be, is a cue is a predicting stimulus, the reward is probable, but a marker, the reward is guaranteed. So here we're going to add a cue to this pattern. We've got a sleepy tired puppy, he goes to lie down in the bed, and the reward for doing that is comfort, security and pleasure. Now I want to be able to call on this behaviour, so I add my verbal cue, off to bed, and as the puppy goes to bed anyway, because that's what they were going to do, I add in that biscuit and a bit of social approval. Now I can use the term off to bed, and the puppy goes and lays down in bed, and there's a memory of that having that additional prediction of a reward, not just the comfort, security. They get that biscuit and social approval. So we can use the same routine for asking the dog to toilet in the garden, to hush up, or to follow a scent trail. We can build our cues from these naturally existing patterns. Even if we shape a new behaviour, there will be a temporary or learning cue, which is probably the environment or the location, or I might be using an object or a target, and those will be serving as the learning reward predicting stimulus. So when I train, I usually train in my kitchen, I usually kick all the other dogs into the garden, and there'll be a scent of food, and all of that preparation routine will serve as reward predicting stimulus, cues. Now, this is one of the most important aspects of this technology. The animal, or our dog, selects that which is relevant and does not respond to that which has not been selected. It sounds a bit clumsy, but in essence, if you're saying sit, but at the same time you're putting your hand in your pocket or you're starting to move your hand, if that dog has selected your hand in your pocket or the movement of your hand as the relevant cue, that's what they'll be responding to. But at the same time, if they haven't selected the word sit as relevant, they will not respond to it. So to ensure that our dog selects the relevant reward predicting stimulus, we need to make all other possible reward predicting stimulus variable. So here is our standard pattern. I give a cue, it might be the verbal cue turn, I get the response, she turns around, and I reward with a treat. But if at the same time I flick my hand, I dip my head, I put my hand towards my pocket, I'm also training in my kitchen, I'm facing the window and the other dogs are in the garden, there's a whole cluster of other stimuli which the dog may select as relevant to the reward prediction. So these other stimuli may end up being more significant or overwhelm what I think is the cue for the behaviour. So when I'm teaching my youngster the understanding of cues being some things are relevant and some things are not relevant, I will plan to make all the non-relevant cues as inconsistent as possible. So I'll still train in the kitchen, I don't change the environment, but I'll move around the kitchen as I re-cue each behaviour so that where I stand doesn't matter. I'll use different treats, so I don't have chicken turn the dog on to do turning stuff and something else be relevant to different types of behaviours. I might wear a different jacket. Sometimes my treats will come from my pocket. Sometimes I'll step over and collect the treat from the reserve that's sitting on one side. They don't have to be major differences. We're not trying to generalise the behaviour. We're trying to unfix what could be selected as relevant. And the really cool aspect is that this seems to be a concept that once the dogs have learnt it, that they will select the relevant cue that we both share and learn to ignore the things that are not relevant. So if I'm teaching her to turn, but at the same time I scratch my head or I blow my nose or I pull up my sleeves, those will be non-cues. Those are non-relevant cues. So this is a skill we can't just presume the dog learns. We do have to invest some time in teaching them to select it. The dogs will also learn the venues. So if I'm training at home, I will probably pay 100% for every behaviour they do correctly. But if I'm outside or I'm at a different venue, I might only pay for 30%. They will remember. And they might notice that when other people are around, say when you're teaching class or you're in class, your reward prediction's only 80%. They will be able to discriminate between those different conditions. So where you are becomes a relevant reward predicting stimulus, because if we have this variation of the reward values that's predictable in these different locations, the dog is likely to learn the difference. So a marker is a cue and a cue is a marker. The marker serves as a cue because when the dog hears a known marker, which might be a clicker or a yes, the dog will orientate to where that real force is coming from. But just as equally, a cue also functions as a marker. Both are reward predicting stimulus. So we begin with the usual pattern. We give the cue for behaviour, the dog does the behaviour, we mark it, and then we reinforce. So I give the cue to spin, but what if I see a different behaviour? What if the dog does nothing or does the correct response, but it's a poor quality? I then re-cue the spin, the dog gets it right, and I reward. What's starting to happen is you're building up a chain of the incorrect response, and then the correct response, and then the reward. So we need the discipline when we see a response that is not something we want to reward, is we need to stop. I usually laugh and I say, that was not what I was looking for, let's try again. And when I set the dog up to try again, I will come back with the original cue that taught that behaviour. I want to ensure the dog is successful. I don't want them just trying anything to see what's going to get a reward. And then as I run through the next 2 or 3 repetitions, I will fade that learning cue or the work in progress cue that I use to actually teach the behaviour. And as I fade my temporary learning cue, I tend to slide it along, so it's just happening as the correct response begins. So I might have had a hand signal to teach the spin. So I'll give the verbal cue spin, hand signal, spin, hand signal. And as the dog performs the correct behaviour, my hand signal, which is also a reward predicting stimulus, is going to occur just as she starts the behaviour. So this marks remembering which is the correct behaviour, but then I can also add a marker for having completed the correct behaviour. So cues are really, really strong markers. So just as the cue can unintentionally mark, we can also use it to intentionally mark. So for any behaviour where we're looking for duration, holding a position, a sit, a down, stand, I will mark with the wait cue. And during movement, say perhaps healing or carrying an article, the cue for that movement will occur again. I recue the behaviour just before the point where the dog is predicting the reward, where you'd normally have marked it with a clicker. And I will repeat this several times. For longer sequences, the recues support the behaviour whilst we build the stamina to be able to do that behaviour for longer. Then once I have my sequence going on for much longer with the supporting recues, I will then begin to fade those when the dog is showing a good strong behaviour. But whilst they're building their stamina or their confidence in repeating the same movement again and again and again, support the behaviour with those recues. But if we're building this sequence and we see the behaviour starts to fade or the dog hesitates, and then we recue, that will serve to mark the hesitation. The result is a very unstable behaviour of varying strength. In actual fact, you can often see the dogs start to fade to see if we will recue. We recue, they start to do the behaviour again, and then we reward. You particularly see this when using a wait cue, as the tendency to re-prompt when we see the dog begin to fidget or look uncertain. And then, of course, what we're doing is actually marking that fidgeting. So in this video clip, I'm using the cue for a known, well-established behaviour as a marker to shape another behaviour. This is the power of a cue. So the behaviour that she's very strong at doing is the behaviour turn, which is a clockwise spin around. So as she starts to put her feet on the stool, I give the cue turn, she turns, and I click the turn. So this is not an illustration of how to do shaping, but you'll see the behaviour gets stronger because the word turn is marking the new behaviour of putting her feet on the stool. So this is why if you've given the cue to lie down and the dog sits and then you recue the lie down and click and reward, the lie down works to mark the sit. But remember, it's up to the dog to regard the recue as a marker. Turn. Yeah. Turn. Yeah. Oh. Turn. Yeah. Turn. Yeah. Turn. Yeah. Turn. Good. We've taught the dog to discriminate between what are the relevant cues and what are non-relevant cues. But we also have to move on to teach the dog to discriminate between all the relevant cues that may sound very similar. So dogs can develop exquisite discrimination skills, picking up on the finest micro cues in different scents or movements and gestures, but it does need a structured development and practice.
Pole. Good boy. Good boy, wait. Apricot. Excellent. Pole. Good boy. Wait. Pineapple. Excellent. Good. Pole. Good boy, well done. Wait. Apricot. Pole. Excellent.
In that video, Kim used the sit with a weight to teach the dog to hold position whilst giving a cue, apricot, that sounds like a cue but is not a cue. We begin with teaching the difference between a cue and a non-cue and the correct responses. For a scent, sound, signal or movement that is a non-cue, so something like me scratching my ear, coughing, zipping open a pocket, the correct response will be default, which will be a behaviour we have taught, and that must gain the same value as the correct action to the cue. If we only reward the actions, the dog will be continually trying to do stuff rather than have the confidence to hold the default and communicate to us that is a non-cue. So if Kim had only clicked for him going around the pole, but if she said apricot and he didn't get anything for it at all, the vast difference between the amount of effort it took to respond and not respond becomes exaggerated. And often it's harder, particularly for a dog like a collie, to not respond to a cue that sounds like a cue than it is to go and do something. So if we only ever reinforce the dogs for the doing bits, we teach them that everything that sounds like a cue, they should be finding something to do. We're going to teach the dog a default behaviour. Now, default has different understandings. The first one, probably to default, means to fail to pay or to meet a legal obligation. In computing, the default is the value outside user intervention. So it's the value that the factory setting for the computer. We go back to the default setting. And that makes something usable out the box. But dogs do not have a default setting. The third one is the default effect, and this is a choice if the chooser does nothing, and it will vary with different environments. So the default behaviour is the option the chooser ends up with if she does not make an active choice. Now, I'm sure many of you have travelled through busy airports, and my time in aviation, one of the issues we had was the default behaviour when people didn't know what to do. So they often arrive in the terminal and they don't know where to go. So they will just stand still in the doorway. And of course, many of these people have got large trolleys with baggage on it, and somebody else will come up behind them and crash into them. Or people are landing and they're coming out through the after they've been through customs, looking for somebody to pick them up, and they don't know what to do, they don't know where to go. There's too much signage, too much choice, so we end up with these very long alleyways which have rather unfortunate names, where people can stand behind barriers trying to see the people that are walking up and down behind the area. So they would do the default behaviour. So often when people don't know what to do, they just stand still. Now that will often happen with dogs. So we see a young puppy of 16 weeks old, they're walking out on the street and they see something they've never seen before, they will stand still. It's a natural survival mechanism because it stops us getting into danger until we've actually made a choice as to what we should be doing. Is this an opportunity or a threat? So the same is going to happen when the dog hears a cue and they go, "Oh, I should remember that, but I can't remember what it is." Or that sounds like a cue, but it's not exactly the same. So I think I'll just stand still. Or you could teach the dog to sit. You can choose what you want that dog to do in different situations. So if I'm walking down the street and my dogs are unsure what to do, they will just come to a stop. And I'll recognize that as a moment in the default where they do not know what to do, and I will stop with them. That will reinforce that behaviour. If I'm doing a formal training session and I've asked my dog to spin and by accident I've gone circle, and the dog says, "This is not right, I can't do that here," they will stand still and look at me. That's information from them to me. They are unsure what to do. So your default behaviour is a very important point where you listen to what is happening for that animal, that person. So in more detail, when we're going to get this default, a cue is a choice that we give the dog and it's an opportunity for them to earn a reward. If they can match that cue to the behaviour they've learned with it, bingo, they gain a reward. If there is no response, there are three obvious reasons as to why, and we need to work out why there's no response. The first one is the dog is conflicted. So I might ask my dog to lie down, but I haven't seen that there's another dog watching them from over the other side of the room, and at this moment in time to lie down would put this dog into conflict. Or I might ask the dog to roll over, that would be the same thing. They could be conflicted because it's uncomfortable to do it in this environment. You know, the dogs do have a right to go, no, not right now, this is not a good idea. It may be a new environment, they've never done it in this place before and they're just querying it, or it might be just too much effort to do it at the moment, or they're tired. The second reason is they may be facing a cost. So they could be giving something up that is a current pleasure or reward. So they're sniffing, and they're sniffing something that's really important to them, and we say, "Hey, come with me." So they've got to give up something that's pleasure to come with you for something that in their experience is less pleasure. They could be watching the birds, yes, and you're saying to them, "Look at me," and they're, "I'd rather watch the birds." So if responding to our cue represents a lower value reward in their experience, the answer is going to be, no, not right now. And then this third one then, which we really need to listen to, is at this moment in time, I cannot recognise what's just happened as a cue, or I don't remember what it is. You may be too far away. You may not have said it with the same tone, and dogs are very, very good at picking up tonal differences, or there's too much noise going around the environment. So we want to give some thought as to what is the default behaviour, mostly in different situations. The dogs can obviously recognise that in certain environments, certain behaviours happen. Now, because I have border collies, I learned very quickly on the first border collies that I had never to play with the ball in the sitting room when you want to watch television. So my sitting room is a room where we rest. We don't play in the sitting room. So that's the default behaviour for that room. So I often like to work at the kitchen table on the computer, and at that time I don't want the dogs mugging me for attention or knocking my elbows as I'm working. So that situation where I get busy at the computer, my default behaviour is go play with your toys. And to teach this, I used to have a toy box, and when they're youngsters I would tip the toy box out and then sit down at the computer. You may have a situation where visitors arrive, your dogs get overexcited. You can teach the dogs that when these visitors arrive, you go out to the garden to play. So as the visitors are coming, you take some treats and you put them out in the garden, or you put toys out there or a snuffle mat, and they will start to go to the garden as they hear the visitors arrive. That is the default behaviour for that situation. If I'm teaching in class, one of the first things we do is teach all the dogs the protocol called the adults are talking, which is settle at my side. And so any time that I start to go into my, okay class, if you'd like to move over here, all the dogs will start to naturally settle at the people's feet. So they take that on the default of me starting to talk. And again, if I'm in a formal training situation, I particularly want my dogs to station in front, facing me. So you need to be able to set up the success for the default behaviour and pair it with the actual situation it's going to happen in. And then after a few repetitions, you won't need to actually cue that behaviour. But you do need to reinforce it. Simple discrimination is usually one of the first stages of the pup learning that certain stimulus are associated with certain events or outcomes. But complex discrimination is a more advanced skill, and that is developed over time. We can teach this as part of our everyday interaction. Dogs are going to learn this just by watching us. They discriminate from the clothes you're wearing as to what activities will have an impact on them. They will recognise your shoes and know that certain shoes means we're going for a walk, and when you put your slippers on, you're settling down for the evening. So to teach this discrimination, we need that feedback default information so that we can reward their responses when they clearly say, this is not a relevant cue, I do not know it. Then we can begin to see their understanding and reward their discrimination. We begin by checking our default for this situation. So I'm in formal training and I will run through some familiar cues, rewarding for each one. I give the cue for a spin and the dog spins, reward. I give the cue for pole and the dog goes around the pole, reward. I then give a cue that the dog has not learned, apricot. On first hearing an unknown cue, the dog is going to hesitate. What? And at that exact moment, we click and reward. You reward the hesitation. If you need to, you can give a hand signal that cues the default, hold your position, and take up the default. We then go on to familiar cues and known cues. So you interchange known familiar cues and then a brand new word they've never heard before. And when they hear something with the support from your signal, they will confidently stand there and say, nope, I don't know that one. So we're teaching the dog to say that it's okay, I do not know that cue. And the really cool aspect is that this appears to be a concept that dogs learn on verbal cues, but then transfer that to visual cues or whistles or scent cues. Bright dogs. So this is a dog's world. It's full of opportunities for rewards, and rewards have different values at different times. They're perfectly capable of experience discrimination between which rewards are on offer and which stimulus to choose to respond to. So they could choose to sniff the ground, or they could choose to stop and watch the birds, chase a squirrel. These are all their choices that they make all day long. I also then teach specific behaviours that I add cues to and specific rewards. Walk with me, turn, sit by my side, go round the pole. Under certain conditions or contingencies, these rewards for these taught behaviours are available. So I don't want them going around the pole when these rewards are not available. I ensure that the dog sees these contingencies are announced. I'll open up my treat pot or put on my training jacket. I will give a reward so I'm sure they know we're offering the learnt behaviours. Or I might start playing with the toy, put the dog on a lead, and then after that the cues change their order of hierarchy. So the cue hierarchy is the reward hierarchy, and it's just another way of looking at distractions. They're only distractions under specific conditions. But unless the dog is fully aware of the reward availability, they are free to choose their rewards. Opportunities for better rewards are likely to appear completely unannounced. So we begin our training with familiar cues, and we've asked the dog to jump, they've done the right action, and we've given them a treat. And then suddenly there's an opportunity for sex, and your young man says, actually, this action is far, far better, far, far preferable than the food you were offering for a jump. Anytime the dog makes a choice to go and choose to respond to a different stimulus or a different reward that's on offer, this is just information that what we're offering is of lower value. So we increase the value of our rewards, we have a much better game, we build a long history of this, and then when these opportunities arrive, the best reward comes from us. The difference is our reward is reliable. Just occasionally you may need to let that young man find out that sex was not available, it was just an invitation, and next time he won't fall for that invitation. But the good cool thing about this is that when these invitations are offered, it becomes paired with great games with us. We can also use the fade-in protocol. I teach the behaviour I want, I have it on the reward predicting stimulus that is likely to be in this future situation, and I practice it in the optimum environment. There's no liability to a disruption at all. I then transfer to this new situation where the disruptions are liable. There's a squirrel way over there in the distance, and I give the cue for this behaviour, and the dog responds and gets the reward from me. Very gradually, I move closer to that disruption, and I keep showing my dog that my reward is reliable, you will enjoy it, even though there's squirrels over there. And if we build this carefully, the presence of squirrels becomes part of our reward predicting stimulus, our cue for the behaviour we want with the reward that we have control of. Well, thank you for coming. I hope I have inspired some extra enthusiasm for reward predicting stimulus. As a last note, remember that there is a significant journey of practicing between adding a cue and a behaviour being on cue.